Okay. Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. I'm Matt Dozier. I work for the U.S. Department of Energy's digital team, and I produce and co-host our podcast, Direct Current. I'm going to grab this thing. I make a podcast, which is an audio-only format, so forgive me if I struggle with the visual aids. Usually I don't have this. I don't have to worry about it. So let's see how this works. Yep. Anybody? There we go. Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Appreciate it. Okay, so our podcast is Direct Current, and I want to tell you a little bit about it, but first, I have a question for you. Quick show of hands. How many of you here have listened to a podcast? Okay, that's a lot of hands. This is a very with it crowd. How many of you have listened to a federal government podcast? Okay, still a few hands. That's pretty good. But I'm here today because I think we can bring that number up a little more, even beyond that. So Direct Current, an Energy.gov podcast, was launched in May 2016. It was originally created by myself, Allison Lantero, and Simon Edelman, my colleagues on the digital team at the Department of Energy. We're in our third season now. We've produced 29 episodes, and we have a 4.5-star rating on iTunes, which we're very proud of. We really set out to make this show something that we could use to tell stories about the Department of Energy. So today, my co-host is Courtney Creer. She's actually here. There she is. So Court also designs these beautiful graphics that you can see here for each episode. So when we first launched the podcast, if somebody could advance the slide, because this is not... There we go. Okay, so when we first launched the show, we were not sure how people would react. We knew we wanted to do this, but we figured we'd put it out there, weren't sure if anybody was going to listen, if people would dismiss it as just another boring government communications product. But you can see, so we pitched it to a couple media outlets and got some feedback here. So you may start to sense a theme. The department launches a podcast, chances are you'll enjoy it, learn something. Surprisingly great podcast. I like this one. There's a nice surprise in italics. You might actually enjoy it. This is, faint praise, but we'll take it. And then we had Roman Mars, host of 99% Invisible, very popular podcast, say this might be the weirdest thing that's ever happened to me. I'll get back to that in a second. So one of the big questions that we get a lot is why podcasts? Why are we using podcasts for a federal agency? And one of the biggest reasons for me personally is pretty simple. I love podcasts. I listen to them voraciously. I think they're an incredible vehicle for telling stories. My colleagues and I, when we were talking about launching a podcast, we looked at and listened to Radiolab, 99% Invisible, Planet Money, and we said, well, why can't we do that for Department of Energy? And then there's another reason, and so we work in the Office of Public Affairs, and a big part of our role is to communicate what the Energy Department is doing. So I have an audio clip that I think speaks to that very well, if you want to roll that. I'm Matt Dozier.
And I'm Allison Lantero.
And you're listening to the very first episode of Direct Current, an Energy.gov podcast.
So what's this show about? Well, it's about energy, the kind that lights our homes, powers our lives, and shapes our world. But it's also about people.
So ultimately, you guys are here to tell compelling stories about how we're spending tax dollars and how the work that we're doing here is making the country and our economy stronger. Just because we work at a government agency does not mean that we cannot be creative.
So that was our Director of Digital, Marissa Newhall. I think she's right about the importance of telling these stories, the value they have, and the importance that we have to share them with the public. And actually I have a few more clips coming up from our 3 seasons that are some of my favorite moments in just a second.
Plus, you guys keep telling me podcasts are cool again, so.
Yeah. They're definitely cool again.
Thanks, Marissa. No problem.
All right, let's get started. Buckle up for a journey through all 17 national labs in 17 minutes.
there's really, almost nothing more satisfying than finishing this one-of-a-kind custom piece of glassware.
And the first time we tried to print the car, it was a complete disaster. It started to peel apart like a stack of cards.
The scientists here are trying to understand the very fundamental building blocks of the universe. Why you can never find one quark alone.
It's the basis of all chemistry and all biology.
Pure, clear water, delicious tasting. And then one daughter started having stomach problems.
It was apocalyptic. I mean, I lived at ground zero.
My house, we lost power, we lost part of our roof, but I mean, that was nothing. The city was a mess.
How does the fire influence the atmosphere right around it? That actually has a huge impact on the way the fire spreads.
We can soak up oil, squeeze it out, soak up more, squeeze it out over and over and over again until literally you just get bored or tired.
He basically built that plant almost single-handedly. He was literally working on this up until the day before he passed.
I think what we're seeing is the birth of a whole new generation of makers that are going to really transform society. To me, the future is extremely bright.
So the Department of Energy is just chock full of these amazing stories, these incredible people doing fantastic research and work that has a real impact on people all around the world. And what better way to tell those stories than through their own voices and through the voices of the people who are directly impacted by this work. But also, just because we're a government agency doesn't mean we need to communicate like a boring bureaucracy. And I have actually another clip that I think speaks to that as well.
Each week on our program, which is the theme, this week's theme, You Light Up My Life.
From the physics of diapers to the mysterious death of a U.S. president.
I called the person who first taught me about acid rain, my 6th grade science teacher, Mr. R.
Okay, that's enough. Welcome to Quark's Corner.
You can't talk about nuclear power in pop culture without talking about
Which leads them to an alternate dimension and Department of Energy.
I love that the Department of Energy issued a public statement that they're not evil.
I just want my flying car.
So a burrito contains more pound-for-pound energy than a stick of dynamite.
Wow, you this burrito? What up, you right now?
This is 99% renewable. I'm Roman Charge.
I strung up the lights. As hard as I tried, some of the strands would only light up on one side.
So prepare yourself to step into a world of
From W Energy in Washington, it's This American Light Bulb, distributed by the American Public. I'm Irish Fiberglass. Stay with us.
Okay, so that was Dan Wood, our former colleague, doing the dead-on Ira Glass and Roman Mars impressions, hence the tweet from earlier about it being the weirdest thing that had ever happened to him. So, we can have fun. I think adding humor, a little bit of levity, lightness, and even some silliness can help people digest these stories, these topics that are sometimes complex, sometimes boring, and sometimes uncomfortable. So the third answer to why podcasts is the audience is growing. And you can see here, this is data from the Infinite Dial done by Edison Research and Triton Digital, showing the growth of percentage of Americans who have listened to podcasts in the last month over time. So you can see in 2018, and the age ranges from 12 all the way up to 54, almost 1 in 3 people has listened to a podcast in the past month. So the audience is growing. So this is something that we're trying to leverage from the Department of Energy as a vehicle, a new tool in our toolkit that is reaching a growing audience. I don't want to sugarcoat things. Podcasts are a lot of work. What you're looking at in the background of this slide is the workflow from our last episode that we put out about nuclear energy. It ran about 38 minutes long, one of the longest we've ever done. And we take sort of an NPR-style approach to doing our podcast. Not every podcast takes this many components. You can see all the different interviews and tracks and music clips and sound effects that go into it. So it is a lot of work. There are many, many steps involved. And I say this not to scare you away, but to encourage you to be aware of what you're getting into before you leap in feet first. It is something that benefits from a lot of planning and involving a lot of people to work with you that will help share the burden. Podcasts are a lot of work, but they can pay off in unexpected ways. So if you can't see this, so this is a tweet by Bill Gates. It says, "I really enjoyed this podcast. Take an audio road trip to Energy's 17 national labs in 17 minutes." This is an episode we put out in 2017 that we tried to cram 60-second stories about each of our 17 national labs all into one episode. I thought it came out really great. It was a fun challenge. Everybody should go listen to it. But this is tweeted out then by Bill Gates, who I think at the time had 38 million followers. That's something that we would never have had the opportunity to do if we weren't doing this podcast. So you never really know what benefits you're going to reap from it. So that's us leaping up the charts after the Bill Gates tweet. We've had other opportunities as well with the podcast, including 2 secretaries of energy have been on the show. We recently won an Adobe Government Creativity Award. We've had 800,000 total downloads, and we're getting about 60,000 downloads a month. So podcasting in the federal government is on the rise. There's, I think NASA has 3 different shows. There's Smithsonian's really popular Side Door podcast. The NOAA Ocean podcast has been going for a while. And This Is Real is actually from the Health and Human Services Office of Inspector General. It's a 5-episode limited run podcast about Medicare fraud. And I actually consulted with them as they were putting this together. So it's actually really great. So go check it out. So what have we learned? Well, planning. I really can't stress enough that this is something that you want to have everything figured out before you hit record. We spent a year before we launched Direct Current talking to each other, talking to outside sources about what's going to be an effective show, figuring out what the name is going to be, what the logo and title are going to look like, what format we wanted to take, how long the episodes were going to be. So there are many things that you really want to figure out before you dive into this world, and that will help you in the long run. Compelling stories and voices are key. This is your bread and butter as a podcaster. This is the only thing you have to grip people's attention and compel them and get them emotionally invested. So you want voices on the show that are diverse, that are enthusiastic, that are capable of helping the audience form an emotional connection with the topic at hand, which for us is maybe science or a particular energy source, and so we use that and we can sort of get people invested in this. So what's your angle? The podcasting space is getting increasingly crowded. As I'm sure anybody who follows podcasts knows, there are a lot of really good ones out there right now. So I think that anybody who's interested in starting a new podcast, it cannot be understated how much you need to offer something basically that no one else offers. So whether that's an inside perspective on some particular aspect of the work your agency does, or it's you have a unique access in some way, the angle is really, really important because you need to give people a unique reason to listen to your show over all these other great shows out there, or at least in addition to them. So don't go too broad. I think in terms of that, you want to keep your stories and your topics and your ideas focused as much as possible. It's really easy to let an episode, and we've dealt with this many times with Direct Current, creep out, and it's like you're suddenly not doing a story with a nice narrative flow. You're just talking about a topic at length. So you really need to find the stories that sort of hone in on the whatever broader truth you're trying to tell about a particular topic. The story is what's going to keep people listening, and it's going to help them connect with the material. Offer a transcript. It's a simple thing, but it's, I think, really important for accessibility. And consider your options. If we were to launch a podcast today, I'm not sure we would do the exact same format as Direct Current. When you are starting, you have a choice of locking yourself into sort of like, we're going to produce an episode every month from here to eternity. And I think a lot of people these days are looking at shorter run, limited series that can be really effective and dive deeply into a particular topic, which I think can reduce the burden and make sure that you don't spend quite so much time at the long term working on it. And lastly, you can do this. I mean, this is within your grasp. It doesn't take a whole lot of equipment. It doesn't take massive training. It just takes a knack for storytelling and compelling voices, and a decent microphone really helps. So I'll end this the way I end every episode of Direct Current. You can find us on iTunes. Leave us a review and a rating. That always helps. We're on the web at energy.gov/podcast, and you can email us at directcurrent@hq.doe.gov. If you have any questions, you want to learn more about our process, I'm happy to answer. And that's it. Thanks for listening.